Okay, let's do the last review. This is going to cover units 7 and 8 quiz and includes a lot of topics. So I'm going to go kind of fast, but I think overall you'll get the gist. Again, the tips are the same, and unit 7 and 8 cover post-World War II, Cold War, decolonization, the Arab-Israeli conflict, key organizations like the United Nations and the European Union, also global issues which are also synonymous with current events. So if you get an essay in this unit, one of the themes can be global issues. You can see that the task asks you to select two global issues, describe how the issue has affected a specific country or region, explain a solution that has been proposed to address the issue, and discuss the extent to which the solution has been successful in solving the issue. Some of these issues could be deforestation, nuclear proliferation, that's when many countries start to get nuclear weapons, AIDS, famine, terrorism, refugees, pollution, desertification, and child soldiers. I'm going to stress to you, you don't need to know the science, you don't need to know the medical terms of AIDS. What you need to know is these three bullets. That's what you're looking at. So don't explain, pollution and what the science is of pollution. Explain how it impacts a specific group, a solution, and maybe the extent to which the solution has been successful or not successful. So let's look at World War II, 1939 to 1945, and the issues after World War II. The Cold War, post-World War II China, India and its independence movement, Africa and decolonization, and the Middle East. When we're looking at the Cold War, we're looking at 1945 to 1990 or 1991. And the idea is mutually assured destruction, or MAD, that if one country, a superpower let's say, launched a nuclear weapon, then another country would, and that they would destroy the whole world. Of course, Winston Churchill coined the phrase the Iron Curtain to describe how the Soviet Union had taken over Eastern Europe and controlled countries from East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, etc., that it wasn't a real curtain, but he was saying that an iron curtain had descended across the continent to show that those people couldn't move freely behind the iron curtain. They didn't have a choice in their political systems. Communism was imposed upon them. So the United States took two big ideas, the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan, and basically poured money into the problem. The Marshall Plan was a plan to rebuild Europe and was only offered, really, to any country that would remain capitalist and also trade with the United States. So Poland can't take the Marshall Plan money because Poland is behind the Iron Curtain. Poland is a satellite nation. And basically, countries fell into two camps, the superpower camps, either behind the United States or behind the Soviet Union. During the Cold War, we have periods of détente, which is the easing of tensions, and we have escalation, which is when things get hot. Cuba has a couple hot spots, the Bay of Pigs invasion, which is a failed attempt to kill Fidel Castro, and of course the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was the closest we come to actually having a nuclear war with the Soviet Union. Korea, North Korea invades South Korea in 1950, and the war goes on from 1950 to 53, and that really was the first United Nations action, and it's successful in reestablishing the 38th parallel and containing communism to the north and capitalism to the south. We still have many troops, like 30,000, in South Korea today. Vietnam is not a success in containment because North Vietnam takes over South Vietnam and all Vietnam falls to communism, which really proves the domino theory because at this time also in the 70s you'll see Pol Pot coming to power in Cambodia and him basically running a genocide with the Khmer Rouge, and this is an example of excuse me, modern genocide. Afghanistan is the Soviet Union's Vietnam in that the Soviet Union can't win in Afghanistan. They're fighting a freedom fighter force called the Mujahideen, who actually is aided by a non-Afghanistan person, someone from Saudi Arabia named Osama bin Laden, who we support. course, during this time, we have countries that are not aligned with the superpowers, namely Pakistan and India, because they're having their own issues. During the Cold War, we also have the SALT agreements, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaties, which try to end this idea of mutually assured destruction so that people can decide in their countries to only have a limited arsenal of weapons. I guess people didn't decide, politicians decided, um, but it's part of the Cold War detente. In China, Jiang Jieshi, who's a nationalist supported by the United States, and Mao Zedong, who's a communist, fight a civil war in which Mao wins. Before that civil war, Mao will gain the peasant support on the Long March, which is a 6,000-mile arduous journey away from the Japanese, and Mao becomes a hero of World War II. Once he comes to power, he needs to industrialize China just like Stalin needed to industrialize the Soviet Union. So he says to the Chinese people, we'll take a great leap forward. We'll build great amounts of steel. Go and burn, melt down all of your equipment and your rakes and your pots and pans in your backyard and make steel. Unfortunately, as we know, it made very weak steel. He also said, kill the sparrows. They're eating all of our food. And so people went on this great sparrow campaign. They killed the sparrows, and then they had an overabundance of insects. And there was great famine because the food was not distributed properly, and people who actually grew the food didn't get enough to eat. And so the Great Leap Forward, I like to call it the Great Leap Nowhere, because it's such a failure in both making any industrialized products and making enough food for the people of China. So then Mao in 1968 says, no, what we need is a cultural revolution. We need people to really believe in communism. So read from mine, quote from mine, and learn from my little red book. And here are my red guards, my crazy teenagers, and my little red scarf girls, and let's write Dazi Bows about people and criticize them, get rid of the four olds. Everything we read in Red Scarf Girl by Jiling Jiang. When Mao dies in 1976, Deng Xiaoping comes to power, and he really does start the process of industrialization with his four modernizations. And that's where we get this made in China being more prominent today. Unfortunately, the fifth modernization, democracy, is not part of his plan. And in 1989, when the students revolt in Tiananmen Square, they're very, very, very forcefully put down. And even today, there's lots of censorship and not a public discussion about the Tiananmen Square uprising. In India, of course, that was part of the British Empire, and the quote that you always need to know is that the sun never sets on the British Empire, and that India is Britain's crown jewel. Why? Because Britain was able to get cotton, tea, cheap labor, and a trading location from India. In fact, they ran India like a company for a long time. After the Sepoy Mutiny, Britain starts to take a different way of running India, but the Sepoy Mutiny shows that the Indian sepoys, who are soldiers in the British Army, are mistreated. Their Hindu belief in not eating beef and the Muslim belief in not eating pork is basically denied when the British put pork and beef fat on the gun cartridges, and when the sepoys say, no way, you're poisoning our soul, the British don't really see the point. There's a cultural disconnect. This is the beginning of nationalism in India. It's a slow, gradual movement. Not until between World War I and World War II do we really see the INC, the Indian National Congress, gain steam. And this is where Gandhi, before World War I, will go to South Africa, and he'll fight against the passbooks. This is where he'll burn the passbooks under apartheid. And then, of course, he'll practice civil disobedience when he returns to India. He'll spin his own cloth as a boycott against British-made goods. He'll go on the Salt March, a 240-mile-plus journey by foot to the sea to ceremoniously make salt. He'll have hunger strikes. He'll spend time in prison. And he'll see the independence of his country. India will become free. But India and Pakistan and Bangladesh will be partitioned, will be split, and Hindus and Muslims won't live together in harmony. And this will very much upset Gandhi. And of course, he's assassinated by a Hindu later. In Africa, we see the Berlin Conference based on this idea of social Darwinism, where before World War One, the Europeans scramble for African colonies so that they can get raw materials. This is part of this imperialism and colonization. After World War II, we get this period of decolonization, and some names come up like Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana or Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya, where they get their freedom from England. In South Africa, they're no longer a colony after World War II, but they're not free people because of the apartheid system. Under apartheid, blacks and white South Africans are separated in their home by, where they live, restaurants, movie theaters, hospitals, jobs, everything is separate. We have uprising like Soweto and Sharpeville. Nelson Mandela leads the ANC, and he is found guilty of treason, basically, and serves 27 years in prison. From prison, he becomes this leader of apartheid, and he does things like write letters and have speeches, and his word gets out. And in 1994, Mandela becomes the first democratically elected president of South Africa. And of course, in 2013, he dies. In the Middle East, Zionism is fulfilled, which really begins in the 1880s with a guy named Theodore Herzl. And when Britain issues the Balfour Declaration, basically they're saying they support Jewish settlement in Palestine. And after World War I, Britain and France get these mandates in Palestine where they basically control countries like Syria, Palestine, Iraq, and the people living there don't have a say. And after the Holocaust, the United Nations, of course, led by Britain and the United States, offer this partition plan. But the Palestinians are like, no way, I don't want this partition plan. So Israel is established in 1948 without the consent of the Palestinians. And this leads to the Arab-Israeli conflict. This leads to terrorism from the Palestinian group called Hamas against the Israeli government. This also leads to other conflicts like Iran in 1979 being overthrown by the Islamic fundamentalism and a guy named Ayatollah Khomeini, and taking American hostages, and also fighting an 8-year war with Iraq, in which the United States at that time sides with Saddam Hussein against Iran. And we get this tie-in with Islamic fundamentalism, extremism, and terrorism, which doesn't represent the Muslim world. It represents a small group of people who are trying to basically say that their way is the best way to live, and many of them are against the existence of Israel. It's a complicated situation, and it's also fueled by the need of oil, which is in the Middle East, and the development of OPEC, the Oil Petroleum Exporting Country organization that really controls the supply of oil. Also, during this time, 1989-90, we had the fall of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. In Poland, in the 80s, we get this guy named Lech Walesa, and he leads the Solidarity movement. And because Mikhail Gorbachev, the leader of the Soviet Union, doesn't want to have to fund the Polish communism anymore and can't finance Polish communism anymore, the Solidarity movement really takes off. And Lech Walesa in Poland gets the support of the Pope as well, because under communism, religion is outlawed, and so of course the Pope is going to want people to practice Roman Catholicism if they want to in Poland. We also have the Prague Spring, which is the uprisings in Czechoslovakia. Then we have the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, which really is symbolic of, again, the Soviet Union not bringing in tanks and guns to stop these uprisings and these changes. And Mikhail Gorbachev's two big initiatives, Perestroika, which means capitalism, and Glasnost, which means democracy or openness, really sets this change in the Soviet Union. And one of the biggest reasons why the Soviet Union goes to capitalism is because they did not have enough consumer goods. They were not making enough for their people. People would go to the grocery store, they'd wait in line for hours, finally get into the grocery store, and there wouldn't be enough peanut butter or bread or whatever. Maybe they didn't have peanut butter, but what I'm saying is they didn't have enough consumer goods. Unfortunately, after the fall of the Soviet Union, we have power vacuums or power struggles, and one of those biggest power struggles is in Yugoslavia. In Serbia, we get this idea of ethnic cleansing by this leader, a guy named Slobodan Milosevic, right here. He leads a Holocaust, basically. An ethnic cleansing, he calls it, of Muslim Serbs and Bosnians. And unfortunately, this is pictures that are very reminiscent of what the Allies found when they liberated the concentration camps. And this just shows you that genocide is very, very important to recognize so that we can prevent it and stop it quickly. The United Nations does try to solve world problems, and they have many peacekeeping organizations, problem solving organizations. And these 8 symbols here show you that they really deal with disparity and try to affect change about things like nuclear weapons and drugs and terrorism and human rights, genocide, and development like in Africa, and peace and justice and humanitarian assistance like when there's an outbreak of Ebola, and economic growth and development. The European Union is really an example of the Europeans coming together and unifying and creating a common currency. Almost every European country uses the euro. So if you're traveling from France to Spain, you don't have to change your money. You can travel freely, you can trade freely. It really does open up a greater consumer experience. Tourism grows, but there's also problems because if one member nation, like let's say Greece, isn't doing well economically, then it hurts the whole union. So there are pluses and minuses to this European Union. When you see the European Union, think the euro. Think the euro. If you take Spanish, all your dialogues are about the euro. There are global issues and disparity that we started the class with this year. Hunger, we looked at dirt cookies in Haiti and how Haiti can be in our Western Hemisphere very close to Mickey Mouse in Florida, and yet the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. Not only poverty in Haiti, but poverty in like the slums of India, where you see the process of urbanization and horrible outbreaks of things like cholera and disease. Or the issue of overpopulation, where China has come up with this one child policy in China. Or women's roles, like women not being allowed to get driver's license in Saudi Arabia. Or things that impact the entire world, like the environment, like global warming, deforestation, which is cutting down forest to create mass amounts of farmland. Big corporations do this. Or desertification, when the desert keeps growing because land has been overfarmed. And just the impact of globalization, that we are in a global trade environment. You go on the internet, you can buy from anywhere and trade with anyone. Let's do some practice. The Committee of Public Safety in France and the Khmer Rouge in Kampuchea or Cambodia are similar in that they were loyal to the monarchies in their countries, used terror to further their revolutionary goals, were intellectuals who promoted moderate reforms in their countries, or sought to establish democratic institutions in their countries. 2. The desire for self-determination in African nations became a powerful force for change immediately after World War II, the Boer War, revolutions in Russia and France, or the end of the Cold War, World War II. Which statement best explains why India was partitioned, remember that means split, in 1947? Was it the British feared a united India? One region wanted to remain under British rule? Religious differences led to a political division? Or communist supporters wanted a separate state? Religious differences. Remember, Muslims versus Hindus. In Eastern Europe during the 50s and 60s, the Soviet Union responded to challenges to its control by allowing free elections when necessary, imposing prompt and severe repression, obtaining United Nations assistance, or granting independence to its satellite nations. Imposing prompt and severe repressions in the 50s and 60s. Now, in the 80s and 90s, that's when Eastern Europe can rebel without the Soviet Union really interfering, like I explained earlier. But in the 50s and 60s, Soviet Union, Iron Curtain, gonna go in there and put down the Hungarian or the Czechoslovakian uprisings. Which headline concerning the Soviet Union refers to a Cold War event? Yeltsin assumes power. Trotsky forms Red Army. Germany invades Soviet Union, or Warsaw Pact formed. The answer is Warsaw Pact. Remember, the Warsaw Pact was formed in kind of like retaliation against NATO, and Stalin wanted to have an alliance system, a military alliance against NATO, which still exists today. The Warsaw Pact does not exist anymore. It's a Cold War military alliance between the Soviet Union and her satellites. One similarity shared by the Meiji emperors of Japan, Peter the Great of Russia, and the Shah Reza Pahlavi of Iran was that they all supported. Now, Shah Reza Pahlavi came before the Ayatollah Khomeini, before 1979. Was that they all increased the power of the aristocracy, introduced new religious beliefs, kept their nations from industrial expansion, or westernized their nations. The answer is westernized. One similarity between Lenin's new economic policy and Gorbachev's policy of perestroika is that both policies supported collectivization of farms in the Soviet Union, allowed some aspects of capitalism in the Soviet economy, increased citizen participation in the Soviet government, or strengthened government control over the Soviet republics. The answer is allowed some aspects of capitalism in the Soviet Union. From the perspective of the North Vietnamese, the war in Vietnam in the 60s was a battle between fascism and liberalism, nationalism and imperialism, republicanism and totalitarianism, or theocracy and monarchy. Of course, the answer is always main causes, nationalism and imperialism. The creation of the United Nations, the expansion of the European Economic Community, or the European Union, and the signing of the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, resulted in an increase in political revolutions, non-alignment policies, military alliances, or international cooperation. The answer is 4. Since the end of the Cold War, Cuba has experienced the loss of a major source of its foreign financial support, increased economic growth from expanded trade, expanded political influence in Latin American affairs, or greater independence from communist China. The loss of a major source of the Soviet Union. Which statement best expresses the key issues in the continuing dispute between the Israelis and the Arabs? Both sides have historic claim to the same land. Other religious groups continue to claim rights to historic sites. Israel has been denied access to water rights, or control of oil resources in the area is essential to both groups. Remember, whose house is it? Historic claim to the same land. In Middle Eastern societies, women have increasingly been at the center of a conflict between the forces of modernization and the values of traditional Islamic culture, and the pressure for Palestinian homeland, and the shortage of capital for industrial development, and the need to reduce the birth rate. Of course, this is the values of traditional Islamic culture, from head coverings to male chaperones to not being allowed to drive in Saudi Arabia, etc. The term Green Revolution, which I never had a chance to talk to you guys about, is used to describe the tensions between developing and developed nations, heavy reliance on manual labor in agriculture, protests against environmental destruction caused by industry, or development of new types of grains and new methods of growing them. Okay, I know when you see green you might think environmental, but in this case it's not. In this case, it's using technology, using science. So it's 4. Development of new types of grains and new methods of growing them. Economic development in Latin American nations has been hindered. Hindered means stopped, slowed. So it's been hindered most by a scarcity of goods produced for trade and a lack of natural resources. Governments that are primarily concerned with preserving the environment. Problems of overpopulation, patterns of land distribution, and a lack of investment capital. Or corporations that are not interested in the use of modern technology. The answer is 3. Overpopulation, land distribution, which we've seen since the encomienda system, and a lack of money. Money. Okay, a study of the accident at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, which is in Ukraine, in the Soviet Union at the time, and of the severe air pollution in Mexico City would lead to the conclusion that technology can cause problems throughout the world. International trade is more profitable than domestic commerce. Modern science cannot solve most political problems, or agricultural nations have caused major world environmental problems. The answer is technology can cause problems throughout the world. Chernobyl nuclear power plant basically had a nuclear meltdown, and basically it was like a nuclear bomb went off, and it's still pretty much closed off today. Okay, that's the end of this one. I hope it helps. Bye-bye.